The Chinese Civil War broke out in 1927 and continued until 1950, albeit with the interruption of World War II. It pitted Chinese communists against the nationalist government of China that was headed by Chiang Kai-Shek. Eventually, the communists under Mao Zedong gained the upper hand, and the nationalists were pushed back towards Taiwan. However, what if the nationalists had won instead? How would China and the world look like today? Here's one scenario that could have happened. The main reasons why the communists won was support of the people, aid from the Soviet Union, and good tactics against the nationalists. Sure, the nationalists controlled much of China and its population in the early stages of the war. Given the fact that the United States had provided aid to them, they should have won, but they didn't have nearly as much popular support as the communists had. Also, the U.S. aid provided to the nationalists was often unreliable and racked with inconsistency. So, since we have examined why the nationalists lost, let's examine where they probably could have turned the tide of the war. In the early months of 1946, the war seemed to be going the way of the nationalists. The battle-hardened troops of Chiang Kai-Shek were crushing the communists and occupied southern Manchuria by May of that year. They had reached the outskirts of Harbin when the U.S. threatened that if they didn't stop, aid would be restricted. This was a crucial mistake, and when the nationalists stopped, they lost their last chance to really defeat the communists. So what if they hadn't stopped? Either the U.S. doesn't ask them to stop, or Chiang goes against their wishes in the final all-out charges against the communists. If they were to take Manchuria and deal a crushing blow to the communists, it may have been that Zedong instead has to flee to Taiwan. So in that case, what would happen? There would probably be widespread instability and chaos after the nationalists returned to power. As we said before, it's not like they had widespread support among the peasants of China. So there would be pockets of guerrilla fighting that Chiang would have to deal with. There would be likely mass purges to get rid of supposed communists. This action would likely be the only one that could successfully oppose the communist opposition. To add to this headache would be Chiang's brutality. We all know of how Zedong's policies led to the death of millions of Chinese, and he destroyed classical Chinese culture in the Cultural Revolution. But evidence suggests that Chiang might have even been a worse dictator than Mao. He ruthlessly executed his enemies, drove the Chinese economy into hyperinflation, and was notoriously corrupt. We can see this in his rule over Taiwan. In an incident known as the White Terror, he arrested 140,000 people that were supposedly bandit spies. Surprisingly, Chiang looked back on his past corruption and began to purge it from his government. However, much like Mao, he suppressed traditional languages and culture, promoting Chinese nationalism instead. So we would still see cultural revolution, although not nearly to as large an extent as that of Mao. Let's move on to the economy. Chiang may have been a notorious dictator, but his economic record is pretty sound. Today, Taiwan is one of the so-called Asian tigers and an economic powerhouse. The Land Reform Act and economic aid from the Americans boosted the Taiwanese economy, and we could see this happening on a much larger scale in mainland China. Of course, Taiwan is much smaller than China, but given its economic success, and the fact that even the communists were able to pull it off, we could see an economically powerful China today. Let's talk about the Cold War. The new nationalist China will likely be even more of a battleground for the Cold War, as the presence of a capitalist nation, and the world's most populous one at that, would not appeal to the Soviets. There would be higher tensions between the Soviets and the Chinese in this timeline, although I don't see any actual fighting occurring. Third and Mad will keep that down. With U.S. aid and protection extended to the Chinese, Sino-American relations will be much better. Chinese and Americans wouldn't have as much a history of competition and tensions as they did in our timeline. We could even see an active American-Chinese alliance in the Asian sphere. The fact that China is not red in this timeline poses a serious blow to communist power, as the world's most populous nation would be on the side of the capitalists. Sure, there would still be likely a repressive regime and all, but China will never be communist. And as always, thanks for watching.